Great. Good afternoon, everybody. So, what I'm just going to try to run through relatively briefly is some of the things, some additional recommendations and suggestions of what you can do. Feel free to put questions in the question windows as we go, and I'll address what we can as dynamically as I can. And then for things that I have to leave to the end, I'll try to make sure I tag back to them at the end. All right. So. First things first, a little bit of background. I'm the co-founder at Bell Curves, and we're a New York-based test prep company that runs courses in a bunch of different cities. There's all of our information. We've been doing this for a long time, about 10 years now, and primarily we work with public schools, nonprofit organizations, things of that nature. So basically the profile of most of the people on the call. So we have a lot of experience in that area. If you care, you can come back and look at my profile. I've been doing test prep for 20 years, and I've done every test in creation fundamentally. If it has bubbles and is used for admissions, I've probably done something with it, from the IC for 5th graders to the LSAT for law school applicants. All right, so a couple of things to identify first, to get a little bit more granular about some of these things and a little bit more specific, is what leads to bad scores and what you can possibly do about it, right? I think the one thing that tends to be overlooked more than anything else is content knowledge. So to the extent that you can support content knowledge for students is going to be helpful, meaning if your student is not doing well in Algebra 1 and hasn't taken geometry, then the SAT and the ACT aren't going to work out so well, because those tests are fundamentally based on the principle that these students have completed algebra, geometry, and have begun for the ACT a small introduction to trigonometry. So making sure that the knowledge base of the student is in line with what the test, right? So then there becomes test savvy, which I think most people tend to focus on when they're talking about testing, but test savvy in and of itself isn't going to help if they don't have content knowledge. So make sure that in anything you do, you address content knowledge as well as testing savvy, so to speak. And then habits. I think that there's a huge disparity between what standardized tests ask students for and what school asks students for. So getting them to transfer those habits from one type of questioning to another is important to help them develop better testing habits. And then overall reliance on things like, I just finished a course for the May SAT, and despite constant reminders, the students didn't actually bring calculators, because in their algebra class in school, the calculators are in the room for them and they don't own their own. So now if you have a student going into the SAT with a graphing calculator versus a student who shows up with none and expects to be given one and isn't, it creates problems on the test. While you can take the SAT without calculators, most students these days are used to having calculators for any kind of math. So helping break them of their reliance on someone else to give them a pencil, give them a calculator, bring these things for the test for them, I think is really important role that counselors and organizational support partners can play in getting these kids test ready. All right. So what do I mean by that, and exactly how does that look? So in terms of sort of differences in the expectation of the test, this first question is a typical math question where you're told what you're given a polynomial, you're told what to do, simplify the equation, and it's relatively straightforward. However, in the SAT, right, what they'll do, and the ACT to a certain extent does this as well, they ask the same question around the same content, but the way in which it's asked is very different. So to do question 2, a student has to realize, this is a polynomial. How do I approach polynomials? What is this question actually asking me to do? And they also have to pick up on the fact that the question they're asked is at the beginning instead of at the end. So just building comfort and familiarity with different ways of being asked questions is one of the things that you can do to help students. I'll do things like ask students, do you have the time, and force them to only give me yes and no answers to that, so that they start to learn that answering questions specifically is a necessary skill, especially for these tests. And that's something that, no matter your understanding of the SAT or ACT, you can start to force students to be more specific and clear in how they respond to things, and that has value not only on the test, but well beyond these tests. So you think about kind of the different nuances of these things and how they play out and how they, cause students to either perform well or underperform. Right. Again, when we say test savvy, specifically what I'm talking about are things like, again, a question you'd see in a math class being the first one, and a question you'd see on the SAT. In a math class, the reaction to question 1 is probably do the Pythagorean theorem. Well, the savvy test taker will have learned that the SAT almost exclusively does 4 right triangles. And if you know that, the minute I see a 3 and a 5, I know that the other answer is 4 because the SAT loves the 3, 4, 5 triangle. The ACT does it as well, but to a lesser extent. So building that test savvy means building a set of tools that are aware of the habits, the nuances of the test itself, as well as aware of how to circumvent extraneous work and get to answers as quickly and as efficiently as possible. So things that you want to, things that test prep is designed for, right? And I think test prep programs run a huge range. So when you're looking at implementing test prep programs, what you should be asking yourself is, what level of test prep am I interested in? Right? Am I interested in giving them some familiarity with the test? A 2-hour workshop, right? That's not preparing a student for the test. That's giving them awareness of it and possibly some comfort with it, right? Or do I want to try to get them to get their best possible score, which means some significant classroom hours? And when I'm talking about hours here, I'm talking about time with an instructor, not practice test. I think practice tests are different than instructional hours. And the test prep industry, which I'm part of, and I'll freely tell you that, when we're trying to sell you a program, I'm going to include the class. Well, a lot of folks will. I tend not to, but a lot of companies will include testing hours in the instructional hours. And you want to make sure you're separating those things, because a 40-hour class in which 30 of those hours is test is not the same thing as a 40-hour class in which 29 of those hours are actual instructions, or instructional time with a teacher. So make sure you're paying attention to how much instructional time you're giving students if you sign up for a prep course, or if you create a prep course. All right. So as you're starting to look at your options, make sure you dig down into not just price, but what those things are. Comparing number of hours, how many practice tests, 3, 4, 5 tend to be good. What type of materials? Materials are often an indicator of the level of research and understanding into the tests that a company has taken. Because if company A is using Barron's books from a bookstore, it means that they haven't taken the time or resources to customize something that targets their audience, which says something about how long they've been in the business and possibly their level of expertise. So make sure you think through that. And then, of course, class size becomes an issue. So when you're looking at external test prep, you have a bunch of different factors to count into that. And again, when I say hours, I'm talking instructional hours, not necessarily testing hours. All right, so you look into the things that you can do on your own, you look into test prep options and what that means for you, and then you sort of put things in place that your organization can support, both in terms of a specific test prep class and sort of secondary or external to that. Whether it's recommending tools, and if you're going to recommend something, you should vet them to the extent that you can. I've looked at a ton of free SAT sites, because there are lots of schools that we work with that have 200 juniors and can only afford test prep for 20. We don't have a full set of online programs, let's say, and I would love to recommend something to somebody. I haven't found anything that was good enough to recommend that didn't have more problems than value. So when you're looking at online stuff, don't just accept what's there, because a lot of it, the quality of it varies. So make sure you vet anything you put in front of students. Remind them of procedures. I think I've just had 2 students in the last week who were dismissed from the SAT, one because the address on their ID did not match the address with which they registered, another because they forgot their ID. So you're in a position as contact person with these students to make sure that while I'm focused on do you know how to do this triangle question, that you guys are giving us support by saying let's make sure these kids get to the test, can actually show up for the test, have brought their calculators and their pencils and the correct ID. Because usually test prep people won't have created part of their curriculum to include go to the test and bring the right stuff with you. We'll mention it often in passing, but it isn't kind of an intrinsic part of what we do because we're focused so much on the other things. So that's one area that I think that all the support staff for an organization or a school can do a lot to help that happen. And that's sort of being part of the test team. I find the most successful programs for us are those where we are there in support of the test prep program the organization has put in place, and we aren't the be-all, end-all to the ACT or the SAT. So the organization is holding them to schedules and deadlines. The organization helps say, hey, don't forget, there's a practice test on Saturday, right? So the more of those things you guys contribute, the more successful all of these things will go. So be aware of sign-up deadlines, registration deadlines, turning in the fee waivers, things of that. Help students manage their expectations. Should they be looking for a 500, a 600, a 700? What does it mean that they got this? Giving them context for scores versus schools, which are often important. And I think that's where you'll know a lot better than a test prep teacher will what their expectations should be or can be. I will often survey students around what schools they want to go to, but I don't know how realistic that is because I don't know their academic profile to relate to their SAT scores. So I think that's another great area that support team, counselors who work directly with the students can add a lot of value, knowing that, hey, you've got a GPA of 3.5, and while the published SAT score is a 600 to 700, if you get a 550, I've had lots of success getting students in there. As a test prep person, I could never make that statement, right? But as a high school counselor, as a program coordinator, you can probably make that statement to a student, and it'll carry more weight. So help them manage those expectations. And then intervening with parents and schools so that if you're a CBO, schools will often give a different messaging than you will. So being able to make sure that the students have the backup of, we're signing them up for the May test. We want them to take the May test even though their school is taking the March test, giving the rationale and the reasons for that so that the student isn't the one that's trying to fight the system and having to have debates between 2 different adults making different recommendations. Okay, so a few other things that I just want to point to is, Jay sort of mentioned it, building their confidence. But one thing that you can do, another thing you can do, which doesn't necessarily involve knowing the SAT, is helping them read results. Test results from every practice test pretty much look the same. So as a support team, as a counselor, I think that if you're able to read SAT and ACT test results and make recommendations that support any test prep they're doing, or if they're not doing test prep, you can give them support for that as well, such as should they answer all the questions or not, right? Are they skipping the right questions? Those are pretty simple things to learn and to be able to convey to students that will support other messaging around test preparation, even if you aren't the one doing the direct instruction. So, making yourself more aware of the scoring, how to pace yourself for maximizing your performance, knowing the difference between the ACT and the SAT. One thing right away is people mention the ACT has harder math. That's only partially true. The ACT has 60 math questions, of which only 4 are trigonometry, right? And this is on every single test. So when a student is making a decision between the SAT or the ACT, it shouldn't actually be governed by, whether there's harder math on one than the other, because that's mostly untrue. Unless you're scoring above, Unless you're scoring the 90th percentile or better, then those trig questions don't matter on the ACT. They're not making the difference in between getting into a school and staying out. So just be aware of kind of some of those differences and some of the nuances. A lot of the reading and writing stuff is fundamentally the same. There's no real science on the ACT, and I've heard students over and over say, well, I'm not taking the ACT because I'm not good at science, right? Being able to speak to that, what the science on the ACT actually is something I think counselors can do very well and help students make good decisions. Because the science on the ACT is really just, the science section is really just reading comp. Okay, so planning, understanding score differences and test differences, being aware and pointing them to resources, and engaging students in kind of building those fundamental skills. ACT and SAT both publish a book that you can get. I don't know what they cost for schools, but they're about $19 retail. There's also a free practice test for each of them that are available online, and you can encourage students to go online and take an official practice test. That way you don't have to worry about any particular testing company and whether, Bell Curves' SAT is any good or comparable. You can have them take a real test. You can do PSAT and plan, things like that. So being able to point students to those resources is important. Calculators, which calculator should they use? Bringing pencils, making sure that they have the right tools to go into the test is huge. The Grandma grocery calculator, which is in the utility belt here, is a terrible calculator for the SAT. All the free calculators that companies give away are terrible for the SAT and the ACT because they generally don't do order of operations. Now, you don't need the super scientific calculator, but you do need a scientific calculator, right? So being able to recommend a particular model that you know works well becomes really key, and something relatively easy to do. Another thing that I think is really good is things like vocabulary. If we know there's vocabulary on the SAT, helping students manage that and understand that and engage with that in a way that is more useful. I hate the phrase SAT vocabulary because it implies that these words are only useful on the SAT. So one of the things that we've been doing, and this is actually a screenshot from photos we're putting on our Facebook page, is just all this vocabulary that exists in the real world that happens to be on the SAT. So, if you are a college counselor, I would have up a vocab list in my office, but I'd also kind of point to things in the New York Times. And you can engage students in studying words that will help them prepare for the SAT, and that doesn't require a whole lot. Really, any word that students don't know is a word that probably will be on the SAT or ACT, right? So making them understand kind of the value of these things beyond the test itself will help accomplish some of the goals of making testing less stressful and making the process of studying for it a bit easier and make more sense. Those kind of things I think are important to helping students become better on these tests. And that carries through the grammar. These are actually pictures I took on the subway because New York City subway is great for finding horrible grammar and great vocabulary. The SAT and the ACT both test modifiers. This Starbucks ad implies that they cook baristas, which is bizarre to say the least, but it contains a misplaced modifier, right? And the SAT loves to test misplaced modifiers. The other ad is misusing the word less where it should be using the word fewer. So, pointing to those grammar issues obviously will help on these tests, but if you can make it real and show them where it's problematic and show them how it will relate to college and things of that nature, that becomes really helpful to students. So those type of things I think become really helpful, pointing to grammar, pointing to vocabulary, making it realistic and real world will help, are ways that counselors can help students understand what the tests are getting at and make the test less of a big scary monster that they can't handle and more of, they're testing things that you're going to need for college. They're testing things in a way you're probably not used to. They're testing some things that you may have forgotten, and the goal is to, revisit the things that you've forgotten, learn the things you've never learned, but recognize that it carries weight above and beyond this particular test, right? And that'll help, make the process of preparing for these tests easier, regardless of whether they get into a test prep course or start doing it on their own. The internet is also full of some good resources. College Board has question of the day, as does ACT. They also have a free practice test that you can download. There's some other sites like Free Rice, which has a nice vocabulary game that uses a lot of words that are also relevant to the SAT. So things like that I think become really useful. There's lots of blogs. Pwn the SAT's blog is awesome because from that Q&A book that I showed you, the SAT study guide, you can actually send him any question from the study guide and he'll post an answer to it. So if a student is studying on their own, that's a great resource for getting useful answers to questions, because that SAT study guide, so to speak, doesn't actually have any explanations in it. So being aware kind of like the pros and the cons and the limitations of all of these different things, so that the students gain comfort, and resources, and they go into the test much more confident, aware, and prepared, right? Questions. We have about 14 minutes left or so. Would happy to take any questions you have for either of us. Then just go ahead and type your questions into the question window so we can help you address those things. Nothing yet. Okay, so if you don't have questions, my email address is up there. I think Jay had his email address up there earlier, but if you didn't get it, Jay, what's your email? Is it Jay Rosner, or is it, I think it's J, the letter, and then ROSNER at review.com. Is that right? Go ahead. Great. Okay, that works. Elizabeth asked the question, how do you advise counseling students with test anxiety? Elizabeth, test anxiety is tough because the root cause of that anxiety is what you really need to get to, right? So I think there could be a number of issues that cause test anxiety. One is too big of importance is placed on these tests often. So one, I would mitigate the value people place on the tests. Now that's tough to do because in some places the value of the test is true. For CUNY schools in New York City, a lot of the schools have a straight up cutoff. So the test has value. If you don't get in this score, you're not getting into that school. But in a lot of places, that's actually not the case. So for a student with anxiety, one thing I would do is make sure that they understand that the test is not the be-all and end-all of their admissions to college, right? The second thing, and perhaps more important thing I would address is it anxiety because they're getting low scores? And then are they getting low scores because of anxiety? Or are they anxious because they've gotten low scores? Which are two separate things, right? Or are they simply anxious and their scores are fine, right? I think that's even another thing. For a large part of the students I've seen, they get a low score and then become anxious and then stop preparing. So what you want to do is interrupt the cycle of, I didn't do well, therefore I'm freaking out, therefore I'm avoiding it. We've had lots of students where they'll be in a prep class and they'll stop showing up if things get difficult. So I think that addressing what the cause of that anxiety is, and now you're getting into kind of psychology, so it's a little weird, but I think addressing the cause of that anxiety. Are they anxious because they're not getting the score they want? In which case, my response to that is fundamentally prepare more, understand it better so that your score goes up, and then that will hopefully reduce that anxiety. But a lot of times without knowing what the cause of that anxiety is, it's hard to address. Then of course, if it's real clinical anxiety, it becomes a question of, does that need to be addressed by having it assessed in some way and testing accommodations be applied for, things of that nature. Other questions? And you should all be aware, if you're not, of the rules for fee waivers. That would be one thing I would look into. Both for the SAT and the ACT, there are fee waivers available. So make sure you're aware of those and what the rules are for getting them. Generally, they come through the counselor at the high school, but I do know some nonprofit organizations are able to get them themselves. And then testing accommodations. In some states, if a student has an IEP, they almost automatically qualify for testing accommodations, but those accommodations for SAT and ACT have to be applied for separately for any kind of IEP from a school system. So be aware that you may need to do some direction and some support around IEPs and testing accommodations and any sort of learning disabilities and what kind of testing accommodations that would lead to. Okay. Any other questions? Someone asked me to bring back up the slide with the resources, and these are just a few that I kind of randomly thought of. There are probably some others out there, but these I know have what I want and are relatively easy to come to. Other questions? We have one more question from PN. Do you ever have students of color articulate? So the question is, do we ever have students articulate that they feel inferior to their white counterparts with regards to the ACT, given the large national trends? Wow. So I guess my answer, my approach fundamentally to score discrepancies by race, by gender, all of those sort of things, is I try not to increase stereotype threats for students. So if a student isn't aware of score discrepancies, I never bring it up. If a student asks me about score discrepancies, then my response to that varies kind of depending on what the angle of that question is. I think for me it's a lot easier to answer that question because I'm a black man who teaches SAT, so clearly walking in the room, I'm expressing, look, we can do this. And that's usually why, I would bet that's part of why I don't get the question that what was just asked to me about do you feel inferior because you're a minority. I've never specifically gotten that question. I have heard of people getting the question. I think the response to it is so one response, I guess, is the national trends may or may not be, or won't necessarily be representative of an individual, right? The easiest thing to point to a student is, generally speaking, white people have more money and have done more preparation for a longer period of time. Therefore, they're going to do better on the test. Right? So if I have a student in front of me and I also have a prep resource I can point them to, here's why those averages are what they are. African Americans are generally poorer in this country and have less resources for test prep. I've given you resources for test prep. So we've started to balance this equation. All you have to do, show up, work hard, take advantage of it. Because all of those kids with higher average scores are working their butts off. I've tutored kids, I worked in test prep for 20 years, and I've tutored kids for $250 an hour over the course of a year for over 100 hours. So they're spending $25,000 in test prep. Of course their scores are higher, right? Now, I know that's not necessarily the complete story, but that's a story which is mostly true, which will hopefully motivate the student to prepare. And that's ultimately what I want to do. Because the score discrepancies are irrelevant. They are group statistics. Group statistics don't really apply to the individual because any individual can break out of those group statistics, and that's what we really want to make sure we do, is get those students to motivate and to be willing to work to get themselves out of the typical trend for their school, for their race, for their gender, whatever it may be, for their income level. Like, all of those things exist, and that's the biggest correlation, thinking back to Jay's slide, between income level, and that's one of the biggest correlations, income level and average score. Other questions? Do you see any variation in kids of color who are in private schools versus public schools? And what do you do when a kid with straight A's is struggling? Wait, what do you do when a kid with straight A's at struggling school dealing with low SAT scores? Yeah, so fundamentally the question is dealing with variations of student performance based on the schools that they're in, and a student's grades varying versus their test scores. I think those two things are highly related, right? Because depending on the philosophy of the school, the way in which they teach material may or may not make the SAT more comfortable for them, may or may not directly prepare students for the SAT. So if you have students who are reading college-level books in high school, they're going to do better than those who are reading, books that are rated like an 8th grade level. And I've seen that. And that often correlates to kind of, high-performing schools and lower-performing schools. So there's definitely variations across every different educational spectrum you can name. Income, private versus public schools. Private schools do better, but that's a lot of times because of the money that's invested there and because of the family history. Students who come from families with college-educated parents do better than those who don't. So a lot of these things are kind of life-building issues, right? If you have a college-educated parent, they use a larger vocabulary from day one, so that changes the outcome for that student. Mostly, by the time they get to 10th and 11th grade, you can't address those things. What you can address is prepare for the test as much as possible, given whatever time frame we have. And the longer your time frame, the easier it is to address those particular issues. So if I have 3 years to help somebody build their vocabulary, I'll do a better job, or I'll be able to do more than if I simply have 6 weeks. So that's where I think a lot of organizations that have students for long term can do things, right? You can start vocabulary building really early on, prior to really focusing on the SAT, because vocabulary is necessary, period, right? You can start to do that type of thing, which will help. Students with straight A's who struggle on a test, that raises some questions, right? That raises some questions around what those straight A's in school mean and what's the discrepancy between a standardized test and grades in schools. Grades in schools are often driven by things like participation and effort and that kind of thing, which the SAT doesn't accommodate for. So if you have a student who's in a school where a lot of value is put on group work, class participation, and sort of the soft skills, and that might even be factored into grading, then that's going to change kind of how they interact with the test, and it'll take longer to get the student comfortable with the sort of cut and dry, really specific nature of the SAT. Okay, we have time for one more question, and then we're about done here. But as always, you can email either Jay or I with any questions you have after the fact. Any last questions before we wrap it up? Jay, any parting thoughts? So if we have no further questions, or any... Thank you. Well, thanks for participating, everybody. And if you have questions, like I said, you can feel free to follow up via email with either Jay or I at any point. And hope you got something useful out of it. Have a good afternoon.